There we go. Okay, so yeah, this is the link on YouTube. I have created also a playlist that I will just simply post up at the top of the modules page, so you can access kind of everything, and you'll see I've got it labeled pretty clearly, so it's all there for you. Does anyone have any questions about that? Let's get the chat box up. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna stop this share. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get the PowerPoint up just so we can kind of get started on that. So this is the end of last week's PowerPoint, where we talked about the first cities. So we were looking at Sumer, we were looking at the Assyrians, Akkad, and we kind of finished up looking at the Code of Hammurabi. So we basically just have one more slide, which was just simply very briefly about cities in Babylonia. So go ahead and get that up, share, and get participants up. Someone needs to come in. There we go. Okay. All right, so real fast, Babylonian cities. So this is basically pretty much the civilization for Babylonia right here. You can see it on a general map of the Middle East. It kind of shows up right here in the middle above the Persian Gulf. So it's not too far from like Sumer and all that. Babylonia does kind of take over a humongous amount of the area. So Babylonia was a bit different than some of the others, is that women were able to kind of, you know, have their own businesses. It was known for women running taverns and wine shops. And this is actually not too uncommon, especially as we go into like the medieval period, the early modern period. It was one of the few areas where women could actually work independently. And kind of the idea is that, you know, women always having a bit of that nurturing role, working in a tavern, you know, they're there to kind of serve people, feed them, especially in communities where people are traveling quite a bit. Where people really wanted to kind of be taken care of for a night, and also sailors would often go to women-run taverns for similar reasons. Babylonia also made sure to have loads of open spaces like large parks, huge city squares, and this would offer a relief for really terrible smells from a lot of like sewage, you know, garbage, bad water, and of course human waste. They would have kind of little mini canals dug throughout the city for to create a runoff, but they didn't really have a drainage system, like underground drainage system. That came later. So this is what they would do. There are lots of bad smells, so there'd be open spaces for people to gather and get relief from that. And Babylonia was also, sorry, I'm muting, I'm just making sure to mute people just so we don't hear too much background noise. But you have the freedom to unmute yourselves for questions. Babylonia was also quite unique for a lot of new intellectual developments that began happening. And this especially happened in the cities where they had lots of institutions, and because of that, just more learned people. Mathematics and astronomy were huge. So those of you who like math, you have the Babylonians to thank for algebra. Those of you who don't like math, blame these guys. They're the ones that ruined your life with algebra. So they were also really big into astronomy, and astronomy would, as we'll learn about in the coming weeks, was really popular in like ancient Greece and Rome, because they used a lot of astronomy to kind of predict the future, kind of get signs from the gods, you know, or what the origins of the universe were. These are questions that humans have had basically since the beginning of time. They also, along with algebra, invented place value notation. So those of you who also, you know, decimals, and also, you know, kind of inventing zero to sort of start place numbers, this all kind of comes from the Babylonians. And they also created a reckoning of time. And they were the ones that based it on 60 to calculate hours and minutes and seconds. And this is the system we have used ever since. We've always used it based on 60. Why? I'm not sure. If anyone knows, go ahead and put it into the chat, which would be awesome, but I'm not sure how they came up with a justification for 60, but that's where we get it from. It is thousands upon thousands of years old. And then, of course, like I said, for astronomy, they use these charts to make predictions about the future, like I said a few minutes ago. So that's Babylonia in a very brief overall nutshell. Does anybody have any questions before we move on to today's topic, which is Egypt? Okay. So I will pull up the next power. I'm going to stop this share and get the next PowerPoint up. There we go, Egypt. All right. Go ahead and start the share again. Okay. All right, let's get this up and going. I need to get the participants list up and the chat box so I can see. There we go. All right, so today we're going to be looking at ancient Egypt in all of its glory, or as much as I can, basically condense it into just one lecture. Again, Egypt can be an entire semester on its own. Pretty much all these topics could be. So it's a bit of a shame we have to run through them so quickly. So my goal is to give you kind of like a general overview, to give you an opportunity to basically go and look everything over. So here's what we'll be doing today. Some book and film recommendations briefly, and then we're going to start looking at Egypt as the first united nation, going into what's known as the Old Kingdom. There were 3 kingdoms we'll be looking at: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. The Old Kingdom and the New Kingdom are the most significant. We'll be looking at agriculture and the population, knowledge and influence, religious society, the king, not quite known as a pharaoh yet, so we're going to refer to them as king for the first chunk of class, his divine status. We're going to look at hierarchy and gender roles, and then we'll briefly kind of go into the transformation into the Middle and New Kingdoms, looking at the second intermediate period, someone named Thebes, and then the development of the New Kingdom. So you'll see the Middle Kingdom, it was a very short amount of time. And then we're going to look at the development of the pharaohs, slightly different than kings. We'll look briefly at Queen Hatshepsut, which is the, for up until this period, the only female ruler of Egypt, and kind of upends the entire system. We'll look at their gods, Pharaoh Akhenaten, Egyptian life, tombs in the afterlife, and then magic and medicine. So this is what we're going to talk about today. So first, books and film recommendations. One thing I just want to remind you, I'll put this up, is if you want to know a lot more about what we're talking about, the history of the ancient world, Susan Wise Bauer. This is a good volume. It covers the ancient period up until the fall of Rome. And there's like 3 volumes going up to about, I don't know, the French Revolution or the Renaissance. So I recommend these. They're quite big, but the chapters are really clearly labeled and there's extra info. So I could recommend, for those of you who like primary sources, remember sources against the time, or sources about that come from the period in which we're studying. And as a reminder, your primary source is due on September 15th, which is Sunday, I believe. So the Book of the Dead, which was a really famous religious tract from the time period. And then there is a novel called Daughter of the Gods, a novel of ancient Egypt by Stephanie Thornton, for those of you who prefer fiction. For those of you who also want to go back into a little bit of nonfiction, The Handbook of Egyptian Mythology by Geraldine Harris is probably the best book on Egyptian mythology to look at. Another book, this isn't related to Egypt, but another book I started reading last night, which I think is really great, is called Humans, A Brief History of How We Fucked It All Up by Tom Phillips. So it's basically kind of showing how human history developed because of our failures. It's funny and it's really engaging and it's well researched. And there's also kind of like little less unknown information or just funny anecdotes, like how Lucy, the first human we discovered her because she fell out of a tree and died. So kind of that sort of stuff. So I'd recommend this. It's fun. It's, yeah, it's fun. It's informative. and it's new. It was only published last year. So there you go. There you have it. For films, there's a film called Marriage Impossible, also known as White Lie. This is an Egyptian film, modern day. It's kind of like a rom-com, but it shows a lot about modern Egyptian society, which I found a lot of fun. It's hard to find. I think you can watch it on YouTube, or I'm sure you all know your own magic, as my summer students kept pointing out. Also, The Mummy, I'm not talking about the Tom Cruise version. I'm talking about the only version that matters, the one with Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz, which was out in about 1999, I believe. You can rent it on Amazon Prime, last I checked. And for those of you who prefer documentaries and nonfiction, Egypt has its own documentary series also available to watch on Amazon Prime. So let's go. Egypt, the first united nation. We're looking at the time period between 3050 to 1000 BCE, before the Common Era. So Egypt was a city-state. If you remember, kind of like a city that was had political rule along with all the surrounding countryside, city and then surrounding state. So Egypt was initially a city-state of a whole bunch of city-states in a similar region. And this was the first nation to actually become wholly unified amongst everything. So these are the first time in human history that we know of where all the city-states became completely together. Egypt was quite unique in that it's just off Mesopotamia, and I'll show you some maps throughout. It's just off Mesopotamia, like Sumer, Babylonia, everything like that, to be able to get lots of influence of like technology and information and the people and different cultures, but they were also separate enough to develop their completely unique culture. So they're quite different in many ways from the rest of the Mesopotamian cities that we looked at last Thursday. They were considered to be a just and fair society that respected the gods, preserved hierarchy, and obeyed the king. Those were kind of the three things that made the basis of a peaceful Egyptian society. Like all the others, making sure to respect the gods, so that way the gods could provide good fortune upon the Egyptians. Preserving a hierarchy, so everybody sort of knew their place. This was always important in different societies. And of course, obeying the king, which was another way to keep pleasing the gods. Just one reminder, let me know if I'm talking too quickly. Okay, so because I always have a tendency to do that. Throw it into the chat, because sometimes I don't quite realize it. So one thing we know about Egypt, like if people know nothing about Egypt, one thing they will know about are the pyramids. We've seen the pyramids in television, pictures, and we will always have, people just heard about them by being alive. These pyramids were built because of their belief in the afterlife. They were tombs, and for many people, usually the king and the higher ups, but these were tombs as a way to honor both the afterlife and the gods as well. So this is one of the main reasons why they were built. Lots of religious artifacts were housed in there to please the gods. It showed people's wealth and being buried. To this day, it's looking through the pyramids has kind of developed its own field, which is known as Egyptology, literally just the study of Egypt and mythology. This is kind of where the idea comes about of, like, you know, the mummy's curse and different tombs. Of course, that's all, you know, that's all fiction. It's just coincidence if bad things have happened after. But, you know, this is where we get lots of really good preserved items. And, you know, through mummification, which was a way of preserving the body in death, this is how we're able to also find the people of Egypt as well. Egypt, because of these tombs and because of their religious society and their hierarchy, ended up becoming really, really influential to other civilizations that came after, particularly Greece. And we're going to talk about that more Thursday, kind of the different ways that Egypt began to really sort of influence the outer Mediterranean region. Any questions about this first overview before we go into the details? I've had some people emailing me about the best way to take notes. Do not try to write down every little thing I say. It's impossible. Just jot down stuff that you feel is the most important. Sometimes that could be names. It could be the information from the slides to copy down, and you can add 1 or 2 extra notes of what I say. Create your own abbreviations. Don't try to write down everything I say. It's impossible, and you'll actually miss content because of it. So, you know, it's better to write down just a few things and then go back later. The PowerPoints and the lectures are available at your disposal for that reason. Okay, so let's look at the Old Kingdom. So here's kind of a map of where Egypt is located. It's next to the Sinai Peninsula, and then this kind of on the edge goes into Mesopotamia. So it's on kind of like the far eastern side of North Africa, bordering the Mediterranean Sea. So this is the population, or this is the territory of the Old Kingdom, kind of largest all on what's known as the Nile Delta, a series of little rivers that lead out to the Mediterranean. And the kingdom essentially basically outlines the Nile River. Now what's interesting is that the Nile River flows backwards. It flows up. It doesn't flow down. This is why Upper Egypt is actually in the lower part of Egypt because of the direction the Nile is flowing. And Lower Egypt is at the top because that's where the river kind of dumps out into the Mediterranean Sea, which is usually known as kind of like, it could be known as the end of the river. But this is why Lower Egypt is actually at the top and Upper Egypt is actually in the south, because history wouldn't be history if it wasn't a bit confusing. So, all right, so if you remember from our first day, we were talking about lots of man-made climate change, over farming and everything like that ultimately led to a huge amount of salinization, salty water that was destroying the soil and the crops. And because of that, weather began to change and it started to create desert environments, including the Sahara Desert in Africa. So the Sahara Desert is about the size of the United States. It's humongous, but it used to actually be like a really lush, fertile area, believe it or not, full of forests and trees and other, forests and trees, obviously, animals and like lots of populations of people. As climate change began to really take hold in the Sahara, people began moving northeast out of the Sahara into the Egyptian region. The reason being because of the Nile River. All along the river generally is going to have a more lush ground, and they'll be able to kind of grow more crops and have a more stable society. So this is why people began to migrate to the Egyptian region. And this was about 5,000 to 4,000 BCE. By 3050 BCE, based on carbon dating of archaeological evidence, this is when we believe that Egypt became a fully unified nation. So you can see it's a little small here, but if you see all these red dots, those are city-states dotting all along the Nile River, and they were all united as a large kingdom. And one of the ways they were able to be this united is because the kings, or later the pharaohs, always kind of had sort of governors or generals who would go to different parts of Egypt and rule in their stead to make sure that the king's laws were being carried out, to keep everything quite consistent. Think about how we got a president in one spot, but then we have governors of all of our states to make sure stuff is still working. Kind of a similar system here. One of the first kings that we know of from the time period is King Namar, who was also known as Menes. He united the upper region of Egypt with the lower region of Egypt based on the direction of the Nile. So he's the one responsible for essentially uniting all of Egypt. By 2687 BCE, there's evidence of an official capital city that has been developed and established. And this city is Memphis, which is right here, the bolded city here. Memphis, this is the capital of ancient Egypt, just south of Cairo, which is right here, this tiny one. You can look at it later for yourself and kind of increase it. But obviously today, Cairo is the capital, but before it was Memphis, just so that way you know, just south of Cairo. Okay. Any questions about this? Okay. Okay, so one of the I thought I changed those pictures. One of the most grand architectural marvel was the Great Sphinx, which is right here. So these kind of buildings of a large face. A sphinx has kind of like a human face and then an animal body. So that is what's really distinctive, kind of really distinctive in this sort of religion. So the Great Sphinx was a way to honor that. And that's what the main architectural marvel was of the Old Kingdom. It's 250 feet long. It's about 70 feet high. And its purpose is actually a huge historical debate. We don't know why it was built. There are many, many reasons, and everybody's got their own theory, but no one has ever really been able to kind of come to a mass agreement of it. In fact, some people think it was built way before Egypt was united, as far back as 5000 BCE. Again, we're not positive about that, but it is a theory of that goes back to ancient Egypt. The architecture, here's an example of Old Kingdom architecture. You can see kind of how advanced it is. It's large, you know, here's some people here kind of showing you to scale. Pretty large buildings next to some larger pyramids and, you know, pretty solid technology. You can see how well these have lasted the test of time. So the architecture is a real symbol of how wealthy the Old Kingdom was. This had to do with political stability, good trade, and the fact that the territory of the Old Kingdom was fertile land. Oh, I got the hiccups now. Was fertile land that went all down the Nile River. Deserts on each side are what protected Egypt. So they didn't really have to create any natural defenses here. Everything is really fertile along the river, but the Western Desert and the Eastern Desert and the Nubian Desert all surround Egypt, and this kept Egypt naturally protected. Interesting, they use arches for the roof, but not the doorways. That's right, arched doorways come later. In fact, arched roofs, this is quite unique because arches didn't really become mass used across the Western world until the medieval ages. So that's how you can tell how technologically advanced that they were. So the desert itself, even though they couldn't quite grow things in the desert, it was its own source of wealth because they had lots of metal ore deposits. So they could make things like iron, tin, bronze, that sort of thing. They had that on their own. They didn't need to invade any other countries to get it. And part of this is because Egypt also had direct access to the Mediterranean Sea, thanks to being on the coast. And this allowed them to begin to develop seaborne trade between the Mediterranean civilizations and even going into the Indian Ocean to kind of start going into parts of Asia. And we know this based on items that have been found in Egypt. Pottery, other items, ceramics, that sort of stuff. That comes from, ceramics would come from Asia, and the pottery would be coming from the Mediterranean region, such as Greece, of course. Excuse me, any questions about this? I don't know about you, but the smoke has been driving my sinuses crazy.
Do we know if they worship like the statues, like the Sphinx statues?
It's a theory. That's one of many theories, but so probably. We don't know for certain, but there are lots of historians who do believe that, but we can't be positive because they didn't leave a written record as to why they were built. So if you believe it, you're probably not wrong. We just can't quite prove it, but we can't disprove it either. All right, so how did the Old Kingdom actually function? So mainly through agriculture. Agriculture was the most important economic resource, the growing of crops and other items. They had, like in a lot of Mesopotamia, they had annual river floods, and they used those floods to be able to track the harvest. So what the floods did is that it took silt out of the soil. Silt is like a buildup of other minerals and salts and that sort of stuff that can kind of pollute the soil a bit to make things hard to grow. And so these floods kind of cleanse the soil of all of that, and it also cleanse the soil from other salts. And so this allowed annual harvest to actually work really well. And they were really dependable because of it. Because of such good harvest in agriculture, the population increased pretty quickly. And some of the main items that they were able to grow and then later trade were dates, other sorts of vegetables, grasses, and grains, such as wheat. So those were all really, really lucrative items that they were able to grow thanks to these really good harvests. By 1500 BCE, Egypt had 1 million people. This is probably the first kingdom to have over 1 million people. So that's huge. You know, that's like unseen everywhere else. That includes all of it, all the United States. So it is a large area, but it's still a humongous amount of people living along a river. So, but this shows just how good their agricultural system was, that it was able to sustain a population as large as that. One of the really big commodities, thanks to like hops, barleys, and wheats that they were able to grow, was beer. Beer was different back then than it is today, which I'll mention kind of throughout this semester. Beer was thicker, and it was much more nutritious, had a lot more nutrients. So it was a really healthy drink. Of course, it was fermented, but it wouldn't be as fermented as it was today. People drank it on the regular kind of throughout the day because of that. It was a really good source of food, and because of that, it was also a really good method of payment. So a lot of people who worked as laborers would get paid, part of their wages would be beer because of how nutritious it was. What's also really interesting with Egypt is that because it covered such a large area, its population was really naturally diverse, meaning that they had people of all skin colors. Light skin, dark skin, somewhere in the middle, you know, but there was no, what we would refer to as racism because of it. There was no discrimination between people's skin color. They basically identified themselves by their geography, their language. Since it was such a large area, the language was a little different in certain parts. Kind of even like here in the States, you know, we use different slang or different words for certain things, such as, I think, like parts, you know, here in California, we say soda. In another part of the States, they say Coke to refer to all sodas. And I think the East Coast, they say pop, that sort of stuff. So, you know, language differences were really common. The religion, you know, like in Mediterranean cities, different city-states focus more on different Egyptian gods, and also their traditions. They all had very similar traditions, but different ones as well. So it was really kind of unique with that. Quite united, but each one with their own identities. That's how they identified themselves. They simply referred to themselves as the people. So skin color did not matter in Egypt because they were just such a large population, and there was no reason for it to matter. So they were referred to as the people. So like Mediterranean, like Mesopotamia and like Sumer, they had to start creating their own written language for transactions, tax purposes, trading purposes. They didn't use cuneiform. They developed their own sort of system of writing, which is known as hieroglyphics. And hieroglyphics were symbols, usually of animals and other symbols, to symbolize words and phrases. So here's kind of an example of different hieroglyphics. And, you know, you can see that they like, if you look at them, you can see that they kind of look like what they meant. Cup looks like a cup, hand, feather, viper, pot. Some of them look a little different here, like stool, water. And there have been people who have also been able to translate these hieroglyphics into a corresponding letter. So if they were going to write it out in like, you know, our version of the alphabet, this is kind of how we might translate some of it. A lot of outside influence coming into Egypt came from the Nubian societies. So if we go back to the map, the Nubian desert down here, This was kind of its own unique society because you can see that this is where the river really changes direction. And so going into quite different areas. So the Nubian society, as they became part of the Old Kingdom, became really influential and bringing in new pieces of information and writing systems, languages, but most importantly, their trade and their political and social organizations. So a lot of trade they would get from Nubia was gold, ivory, and animal skins. So that is what they were really known for. A lot of the wealth in Egypt, particularly the gold, came from this southern region. They also had a hierarchical political and social system. This, kings at the top, priests, and then, military people, then merchants, artisans, followed by laborers, and then, of course, enslaved people. So this was a hierarchical system they were able to take from the Nubian societies to bring into the Old Kingdom. And it became kind of a standard. This was already used in Mesopotamian cities, but this is where Egypt got it, from the Nubian population. Pictograms work well for cultures that are inwardly focused. As soon as you spend a lot of your time translating foreign items in your language, you start to use a phonetic alphabet. Yep, that's exactly right. Thank you. Great information. I hope everyone has the chat box up so you can see these cool comments coming in. So eventually, Nubia wasn't part of Egypt right away. They were probably the last city-states to join the Old Kingdom. So, and this is because of, this wasn't really done through, I don't think this was done through warfare. I think it was just because of all the shared politics and trade and everything like that. They were able to eventually incorporate the Nubian city-states into the Egyptian, unified Egyptian city-state. Any questions about this? Okay. Okay, so what about the religious society? So I'm sure many of you have probably heard of different Egyptian gods. So there was a really good book I remember reading in elementary school called The Egypt Game, which was about some young girls who basically kind of adopt Egyptology and, do their own sort of thing with it. I don't remember all the details. If any of you have ever seen The Prince of Egypt, there's a song in there where they're singing about the Egyptian gods when Moses first comes back into the Egyptian kingdom. So that kind of sort of describes, or at least they name, a lot of Egyptian gods there. So the king was sort of based on how well they were able to please the gods, very similar to what was going on in Mesopotamia. A strong king was a king who was able to keep the region really peaceful and to have really good trade, to keep bringing in lots of cool goods and keep the area really, good relationships with other regions. A weak king was a king who was embroiled in a lot of political turmoil, meaning that its people were unhappy. There was lots of rivalry with high-ranking populations. They were having problems with other civilizations. So that meant he was weak if that was happening. Not necessarily like corrupt or anything like that. It just meant he was weak and couldn't please the gods, like some character defect in that way. Overall, the king's strength was said to come from public religious obligations. So meaning that he didn't just pray and do his own rituals in kind of his own specific area. The king would participate with this with kind of everybody because he had to really demonstrate his own piety, not just to the gods, but to the people. What would happen if they were considered a weak king? This could bring out a lot of social turmoil and even some civil wars. Egypt did have some civil wars when it came to the kingdom. So really weak king could have people kind of rise up, or rival families rise up and try to take the throne. So they worshipped a huge amount of gods. Similar to Mesopotamia, they had gods for pretty much everything. So, and they were often depicted as human beings, but with animal heads. Not all of them, but many of them. The most powerful god is Re, also known as Ra. So that just depends on the phonetic translations. The textbook uses Re, which is why I've adopted that spelling. So Re is the sun god, and he's the most important god, kind of like the head honcho of all the other gods. So that was the number one. And then one of the other most important gods was Isis, who is the goddess of love and fertility. Again, fertility was always really important, not just in terms of human reproduction, but also in terms of, you know, part of it could also include harvest and animals. And then you have Thoth, who's the god of wisdom and said to be the inventor of writing. So he's right here. He's said to be the one that essentially gave the Egyptians hieroglyphics. So that is where they believe. So these are the three most powerful gods because of that. There are many, many, many others, and it would take too much time in order for me to kind of list them all, but just know that these are the main ones: Re, Isis, and Thoth. And again, in different areas, they're probably spelled a bit differently because a lot of it is phonetic translation. How do people worship the gods? Through many ways that other civilizations did: specific rituals, prayers, and they would have lots of festivals that were devoted to gods. We see this in most religions, you know, Christianity, Judaism, Islam. There's specific rituals people follow in terms of habits, morality, the way they would pray, specific prayers for specific gods, and then festivals, different types of festivals to honor different gods. So Isis probably had festivals happening around the harvest season. Not sure about the others, but these were really good ways to offer the gods. Celebrations, feasts, probably sacrifices at the tombs or the pyramids. I think most likely animal sacrifices. I don't think human sacrifices. So kind of similar influence to a lot of the Mesopotamian regions. Remember, they were close enough to have influence, but they were also separated enough to really make it their own, which is what they did. Okay, any questions about this? Okay, so what about the king? Not pharaoh yet. So the king's rule was divine, meaning that the king was chosen by the gods and that their sons would be chosen by the gods as well. So this is where you have kind of like starting kind of like a dynastic system. So because they were being chosen by the gods. So the king was said to generate a natural force gifted to him by the gods, which would bring order and harmony to humans as long as they had a really stable hierarchy, meaning that everybody lived in accordance to where the god kind of placed them in society. So that had to remain really stable. You know, priests had to stay priests, warriors had to stay warriors because they were chosen to be in those positions. And it was the king's job to make sure that this stayed consistent. This was one of the best ways to prove not only that he was pleasing the gods, but that he had the power to do this thanks to the gods, because these hierarchical positions all came from the gods. And the king was able to enforce that because of that. So one of another really, really important god, and here's a picture of her, is Mot. She's the goddess of divine justice. Essentially, she's the one that oversees society. And they believed that if the king ruled really badly, Mot would allow the kingdom to fall, because Mot was the one who was in charge of making sure society did well. And if it didn't, Mot could make it fall. So she was a really, really important god to please. So this is why the king's duties were pleasing the gods, making laws, and also waging war on enemies to make sure enemies couldn't come in and try to destroy Egypt. So this is the king's job, defense. You'll see this is pretty much the rule of any king throughout a lot of history when it comes down to it. Pleasing the gods to make sure things run well, making laws kind of similar to Hammurabi, and this would help keep society stable to please Mot, and waging war on enemies to make sure that their kingdom would always be protected and would always flourish. Any questions about this before we go into more specifics? Okay. All right, so the king is divine. He's ordained by the gods, essentially. So what's the status here? So the king had to show a lot of piety, and this was often shown on a daily basis through regulation of daily activities. There were specific times. Everything was scheduled out every day for him to be able to please the gods. This would include things like taking a bath for cleanliness. This was really, really important, being as clean as possible. Going for walks or exercising to, one, make sure that his presence was seen by the population, and also to keep himself in as great physical condition as possible, and also having sex, which was really, really important to ensure that the line would continue through sons, essentially. And so this was really important because it would ensure the king's fertility and also prosperity. Because if he was able to produce sons to continue the kingdom, this would keep a lot of really good social stability and political stability, which would allow Egypt to prosper. So all of this was to go to please the gods. So things would get blamed on the king if things didn't work out, such as if there wasn't a natural flood happening one year, and so crops weren't able to grow. This would get blamed on the king, believing that he had done something to displease the gods. He had disrupted this piety. And so people could rebel because of it. And this did happen sometimes. Of course, we know it's a natural phenomenon, things just happen. But people really did feel that it was because the king did not do their job to make sure that they were keeping the gods pleased. Another way that the kings would demonstrate their piety, as I said earlier, was by building these pyramids. They were tombs that honored the afterlife and also honored the gods as well, and it showed the piety. One of the biggest ones that we know of is the Great Pyramid of Giza. This was commissioned by King Khufu, and he reigned from 2609 to 2584 BCE. This is the largest pyramid in Egypt. It was 480 feet high, huge. It was 760 feet long on each side. And it basically it was built out of 2 million blocks of limestone that were quarried from down the river. Because of like minerals and stuff that build up from rivers, limestone is a stone that kind of comes naturally from built up minerals. So it's it's lighter. Limestone is quite light because of this, but it's also pretty sturdy. And it also, at the time, you can see it's weathered with age, but at the time it was a beautiful looking stone. So this is how they were able to transport so much of it. It was light, which made it really easy to carry. And pyramids, like I said before, they were filled with objects in order to please the gods, show piety, and also to guarantee a good life in the underworld. Because your life didn't just exist on earth, it very much went on after you died. So they had to make sure that their life could be just as good, if not better, in the afterlife to prove their worthiness during their time on earth. So this is the reason why pyramids were built. And this is based on hieroglyphics, and it's also based on objects that came from inside the tomb. Remember, the two most important things archaeologists look at from the ancient time period: drains and graves. So in this case, we're looking at lots of graves. So what's the hierarchy that I've been talking about? So here's just kind of like, the hierarchy. The pharaoh, right now we're saying king, but the pharaoh sits at the top, followed by government officials, nobles, and priests. Nobility, really high-ranking family that have the ear of the king. Let me go back quick. Yeah, real quick. I'm just taking time into consideration. All right, is it okay if I move on? All right. Okay, so second tier below the pharaoh, you've got the government officials, nobles, and the priests, followed by the soldiers. Then you have scribes. Scribes itself was its own social class because it took years of training and it was considered quite a noble position. So they had their own social status. This is followed by merchants, those who were the ones that facilitated trade and sales with different objects. The craftsmen, the ones who were able to create things for trade, And finally, at the bottom, farmers, those who created, you know, food and everything like that, and meat and milk and that sort of stuff for sale. And then, of course, enslaved people. How are there enslaved people? Again, usually through perhaps conflicts. Again, people sometimes would sell themselves into enslavement in order to pay off debts or because they couldn't take care of their children. If Egypt was in a war and won, they would capture people and bring them back as enslaved people. So very similar to other societies. So this really strict hierarchy, the purpose of it was to preserve the king's authority and the order of a just society. So this made sure, again, a really stable hierarchy that didn't get disrupted meant that the king was creating a really stable society. So that was really important. The kingdom had to stay really, really pure. No foreigners were allowed in the royal family. It had to be just Egypt to please the god. This is why many kings in Egypt would marry their siblings. The idea was it would keep the line really, really pure. Clearly, division of labor and social structures are pretty important to Egyptians, but new technologies and crafts do emerge. What paths for change exist? How do you move from farmer to craftsman, even based on some new development in the face of society that frowns on that sort of thing? People didn't move from farmer to craftsman. If they were farmers, they stayed farmers. If you were born a craftsman, you stayed craftsman, and so did your children and grandchildren. And so this social hierarchy role did not change. So yeah, and that's pretty consistent kind of throughout history. I would say up until like the 1700s is when things began to change. Really before that, social hierarchy didn't change much. Would marrying siblings and continuing the pure bloodline cause birth defects or miscarriages? Possibly. I'm not positive. I think there have been cases where a lot of, incestuous families did produce lots of kind of birth defects or mental defects. And then I think there actually also were cases where there weren't defects for whatever reason. But generally, it's not the best thing to do, but it's clearly seemed to work well enough in the old kingdoms. So what if the royal family didn't have any girls? Oh, then they would they go probably into extended family or maybe into the noble family, just no foreigners. If they didn't have any daughters in order to marry sons, then it would go to extended family or noble families.
I read something that it said that King Tut, like he had problems because of them marrying over and over, and he had like a bad leg from it and he looked like feminine from it too.
Yeah, that happens a lot. Like physical deformities can happen. One of the kings of England, kind of in the 1800s, I forget which one, but he was known for having like a really, really like long jaw and chin, like unusually so. And that was probably from incest that had happened. Like people married cousins in a lot of those kingdoms. The Habsburgs, thank you. So that, yes, not England, the Habsburgs, like more German area. Some people say that the reason why like Prince Charles has ears that stick out is probably because of cousin marriage that happened generations ago. So yeah, that would happen. Spain, I believe. Oh, thank you. I always forget. The Habsburgs were kind of all over the place in Europe, kind of starting from the late Middle Ages. So who built the pyramids? It was done through a system called corvée labor. So they were built by farmers and other laborers during the off season. The harvest season only lasted a certain amount of time. So this meant that during their off time, they were the ones that built the pyramids. They were provided, they weren't really paid in money, but they were provided with food, housing, and clothing. The taxes that they paid back to the state was through this labor. So it wasn't really a slavery thing because they did get stuff in return, but it was also their way of paying taxes back. Enslaved people did not build the pyramids, oddly, believe it or not. They were usually captured in foreign wars and they served the royal family and priests. So enslaved people lived in the palaces and they also worked in the pyramids, alongside with priests to serve them. They did not build the tombs. And this is because they weren't considered to be part of Egyptian society. Or I'm sorry, they didn't build the pyramids because of this. So the Bible says they did, reality says they are, you know, historical evidence says that they did not. All right, for sake of time, I'm moving on. All right, so what about gender roles happening in the Old Kingdom? So women had the same legal rights as free men, meaning that they could own things. They could own their own land. They could own enslaved people. They could inherit property, which is really unusual. They could file their own lawsuits on, you know, business or any other issues. They could conduct their own business and make their own money, and they could get divorces. Divorce was pretty rare a lot of times in the ancient world. You had to really prove that there were a lot of major issues. And women were able to get these divorces much easier in Egypt. So women in the Old Kingdom, free women, had a lot more agency, their own ability to kind of control their lives. And one of the reasons why we know that they had more equal status is because portraits show husbands and wives next to each other, and they're both the same size in these portraits. Oftentimes, if they're next to each other, if you look at paintings later, women might be smaller in stature, and that kind of shows that they weren't equal. But in the Egyptian paintings, they were showed completely equal like this. And this means that they most likely had this equal status. That said, Bible doesn't say that slaves built the pyramid. Well, the Bible said that the Hebrews did, didn't they? From what I remember. Men dominated public life, which was pretty common, while women dominated the private life. So it wasn't just that they were confined to the homes. They were also in charge of the household. Bible doesn't mention pyramids. Okay, that's my mistake. Thank you. Oh, that's right. Yeah, I didn't mention the pyramids. Yeah, that's right. Thank you. So men dominated private life or public life, but women dominated the private, meaning that they were in charge of the household and the estate and the money and the allowances for that. So it was still a pretty good position of power. If their husbands were killed for any reason, the wives would take on the work, regardless of what it was. And they could also become priestesses, farm managers if their husbands were killed or away for some reason. And many of them became healers. And that was quite common. Usually in a lot of societies, women would be healers. You would later have official physicians, which were always men, but women also kind of had their own sort of ability to become healers on their own, because since they were the ones that were closer to home, they were the ones that knew a lot of different herbs and that sort of thing that could be used for medicine. All right, so what happens? As time changes, these kingdoms start to expand into what's known as the Middle and the New Kingdoms. And we're looking between 2061 and 1081. So we could take a look at this map here. There's different colors that kind of show the, like how the kingdoms were. The dark green, this is the Old Kingdom here. So the Old Kingdom, again, stretching down the Nile. The Middle Kingdom is a lighter green, and you can see it's expanded a bit further out. So it's made it become a bit thicker. And then the New Kingdom, it actually expands further. They go into the Sinai Peninsula. But you can see, and this causes invasions from outside Egypt to come in because of their expansion. So, you know, they were able to become powerful enough to expand, but it also meant now they were at risk of more invasions. So why did the Old Kingdom eventually fall apart? Because there was more climate change, and it reduced a lot of the Nile's natural flooding. And remember, if that's happening, harvests are failing, which means it's the king's fault because he somehow displeased the gods. So this began happening quite a bit. And so this caused a lot of, this eventually caused the end of the Old Kingdom. Rivalry for power amongst leading families came out, and this led to a lot of civil war between the northern and the southern dynasties. So this led to kind of changes in kingship. It also gave regional governors, remember, people who would rule in the king's stead in different areas, it increased their own power. And so there were city-states that could claim some independence from the king. So this really changed a lot in Egypt. So there was a period known as the First Intermediate Period during kind of as it was transitioning into the Middle Kingdom. And this was kind of defined by a lot of famine from failing harvests and the civil unrest that came about because of it. And what this did is it prevented political unity. So Egypt began kind of breaking up in terms of unity. So this was a huge crisis happening. So what the kings did in order to try to reunify it is they began to wage war against these states that were, trying to break off and extend their southern boundaries. So this is how the Middle Kingdom, if you take a look, it begins stretching further south. And this is how they did it, as a way to kind of unify and also show the strength of the kingdom by expanding it. This then allowed for diplomatic and trade contacts to expand in the Eastern Mediterranean, so kind of here, and Crete, which is off the coast of Greece. So it's not on this map, but that would be kind of like over here. So they were able to expand because of it. And what this did is it helped restore unity and pride amongst Egypt. And we get this information from their literature. It might be fiction, we're not quite sure, or it just embellished. But the story of Sinuhe kind of really shows a lot of this reunification and like peacetime coming back. Is all the climate change that happened in BC mostly natural or caused by human presence in the area? So from the period about like 5,000 to 4,000, that was mostly man-made. And then after that, during this period, it was just more natural causes and kind of the ebbing and flowing of, some years of famine, some years of more rain, some years of less. So this would be more natural causes right now. Okay, any questions? Time, oh my God, keeps going against us. All right. Okay, so I thought I caught all my typos. I'll fix that. So the Second Intermediate Period happens between 1664 and 1570 BCE. So the end of the First Intermediate Period, they began to reunify Egypt and make it strong again. But the Second Intermediate Period was a period of more weak kings who weren't really able to control foreign migrants that were coming into Egypt and creating independent communities within Egypt. So this was a problem. This meant that unification was starting to sort of break up again because there were all these independent societies moving in. So in 1664 BCE, bands of Semitic people from the Eastern Mediterranean coast, known as Hyksos, seized power. So if you take a look at this map here, Eastern Mediterranean region coming from Canaan, Palestine, this is the Hyksos invasion. So you can see they're coming down the coast and going into northern Egypt or lower Egypt towards Memphis, the capital. So that's where they were coming from. And what the Hyksos did is they brought a lot of foreign elements to Egypt. So language, culture, religion, goods, knowledge, that sort of stuff all came into Egypt. And a city known as Avaris became Hyksos's capital with wall paintings. And these were kind of known as the Minoan style, coming from Crete off the coast of Greece. We'll talk about the Minoans on Thursday, other populations. So Avaris is right here. You can see just off the coast of the Mediterranean, kind of a direct jumping off point to sail in towards Crete. So they took a lot of artwork from the Minoan people who lived in that region to kind of decorate a lot of the tombs and palaces. Again, we'll talk about those populations on Thursday. But these invasions allowed new contact with Near Eastern states, and it introduced bronze making technology, new musical instruments, which is really cool for culture because human beings have loved music since they were able to. This is where camels were brought in for the first time. Camels were not native to Egypt. They came from the other parts of the Near East. and olive trees. Olive trees, again, were not native to Egypt. They came from the other ancient Near East, more known as the Middle Eastern region, as we will call it today. So this is how they came into Egypt. And also, with this new technology coming in, the military was able to strengthen because they developed war chariots for the first time and better bows and arrows that were larger and more accurate. So you can see here's a picture of a war chariot with a larger bow and arrow, which made them they were more accurate and a lot more deadly, and made the Egyptians much more powerful in battle. So the second intermediate starts out because of weakness and invasion, but then it grows again with a lot of wealth because of this. Okay, so now we're transitioning into the New Kingdom. So the Middle Kingdom really wasn't long. It was mostly all these sort of transitions from kind of unrest going into new technologies. So the New Kingdom comes about kind of thanks to what was going on in a region known as Thebes. So here it is. It's known as a World Heritage Site for historical monuments. It is here. It would have been part of Upper Egypt at the time period. So there it is. Leaders in Thebes were the ones who managed to finally completely reunite Egypt again. And this is what created the New Kingdom. So the New Kingdom is a whole new united part of Egypt, or a united Egypt. The Middle Kingdom was the period where it wasn't, and the New Kingdom reestablished all this unity. This is because those in Thebes, this region, had a lot of connections with rich settlements in the Western Desert, such as the Haraga Oasis. So an oasis is kind of where there's a sort of like a isolated water supply coming from underground that allows like a small region to have lush and fertile resources. And so the people would often, there'd be lots of communities, small communities that would live in and around an oasis for in the middle of the desert. So they were usually in the middle of deserts or really hot places. So, they were kind of like a bit of a godsend, a miracle if you had to travel through the desert and we're hitting a lot of problems. And then, yay, there's an oasis. There'll be water, plants, food, and probably people to help you, hopefully. The oasis settlements became stopping points for merchants. And so they started to create really solid trade routes happening in Egypt that everyone began following. And because of these spots of the oases, they were able to start creating a lot of new contacts with people further and further east, well beyond the Red Sea and going all the way to the Indian Ocean, which is quite off the map here. But they were able to travel eastward. And so this created a lot more expansion into the Middle Eastern region, hence why the New Kingdom spread up further into this area. Any questions about this? Sorry, I know I'm going quick. All right, so this ultimately led to the development of the pharaohs. Pharaohs were basically kings, but they had this new title in the Middle Kingdom. They rebuilt their authority by taking power away from regional governors and created a national identity. So this is what helped allow a lot of unity to come back, is because the governors had taken too much control and now that was taken away. New armies were created for defenses, thanks to new technologies. They also had developed a military elite from mercenaries, people who were hired out to fight, and they were the ones that could become commanders. They established a lot more diplomacy with kings from different kingdoms nearby, and this helped build a lot more international contacts so they could have more political power and trade. Warrior pharaohs were pharaohs that would send armies into foreign wars to gain territory and show their own superiority. So before, where Egypt stayed really isolated and didn't want to have anything to do with other countries, now they were expanding and they were fighting in more wars and stuff. So they were getting more goods, more materials. They began to control land routes all over the Mediterranean that were coming into Egypt and become much more powerful. And they began to get a lot more fine goods for trade, such as ivory, wine, olive oil, And they developed all of these in order to get pottery from Greece because it was so sturdy and was really great for preserving items. So I'm going to move on. You'll look at this later just for the sake of time. So I'm sorry, I'm now going quickly. So I think these are people coming from my next class. So I'm going to ignore them for a few minutes. So who's one of the most famous pharaohs to come out of the New Kingdom? Queen Hatshepsut, who reigned from 1502 to 1482 BCE. She's known as building a massive mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri to really display her own wealth and power. She had to do this because she's the first female pharaoh, so she really has to establish her power. She built another temple dedicated to the god Amun-Ra, and this showed her claim to divine birth and right to rule because, you know, a lot of people were quite against this. Her husband was her half brother, but he died. And so she made herself her female king and ruled with her stepson because her brother had already had her half brother already had a son from a previous wife. So she co-ruled with her stepson. But she managed to kind of take all control and by going against Egyptian law by ruling as a female queen. But in order to really show her authority, in a lot of art and statues, she's depicted in male dress with a beard. So here's Hatshepsut as she actually looked. Here's how she's often depicted in art. So, and this was to show her superiority. And basically what she did is she demonstrated that a woman could be just as powerful enough to provide safety and prosperity with goodwill from the gods. So moving on, probably gonna have to stop in a minute. I'm gonna stop after this guy and we'll have to continue on Thursday. So Pharaoh Akhenaten. So he kind of changed a lot of the New Kingdom. He built a new capital for Aten at the god Aten at Tel El Amarna, and he brought 40,000 Egyptians to help establish this new capital city. What he did is he changed, he was not a good pharaoh. Workers had really bad lives, bad nutrition, dangerous labor, so he wasn't a good king. He completely changed religious practices and forced this new practices on the priests who ran the old cults. I don't mean cult as in controlling group like today, I mean it as religious organizations. And this caused a lot of neglect in terms of defenses. So instead, he used Akhenaten. He used diplomacy to basically turn foreign leaders against each other. So that way they wouldn't wage war against Egypt because they had their own problems. So instead of defending Egypt, he created conflict in other places so that way they couldn't invade Egypt. But there were people who did come in. The Hittites came in and they were defeating lots of allies, such as the Mitanni in eastern Syria, which left Egypt really susceptible to other invaders. This caused a massive crisis, and his religious reform ultimately fell apart after his death. So he was a bad pharaoh, and everything fell kind of apart after he died. Where are we? So we're going to go ahead and stop there, and we'll continue on with the gods on Thursday. So sorry we didn't finish, but remember this Zoom link is what we'll be using from now on. Tomorrow my office hour is going to be between 11 and 12. That's because I have a phone call at 10 a.m., a work-related phone call. So office hour tomorrow is at 11 instead of 10 o'clock. Are there any questions before you go? Those of you who want to go, you may go. Are there any questions? Throw them into the chat. I'm gonna stop the share for now. I'll make a note. All right, you're welcome. My pleasure. Sorry we didn't finish, but I will. We'll finish this Thursday. And remember, office hour is at 11 tomorrow. You're welcome. Have a
Thank you, Professor. Have a good day.
You too. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.